In this question, we are given that last Sunday, a certain store sold copies of newspaper A for $1 each and copies of newspaper B for $1.25 each, and no other newspapers were sold at the store that day. So, the cost of newspaper A is $1 and the cost of newspaper B is $1.25. We are given that our percent of the store's revenue from the newspaper sales was from newspaper A. So, sales of A, it generated our percent of the revenue of the store that day. So we know the percentage of the copies of A that was sold that day is P%. We have to find which of the following expresses are in terms of P. Now that we have all the information that we can get from the question, let's move on to step 2 and understand the methodology of the solution. So, let us assume the total number of newspapers sold that day to be equal to X. Then, if P% of X was the number of newspapers that was sold of A, then 100 minus P% of X will give us the number of newspapers that was sold of newspaper B. We are also given that our percent of the revenue of this newspaper sales on that day generated by the number of copies of newspaper A that was sold. Now, keeping this in mind, we move on to step 3 and find out the revenue generated by the newspaper A and the newspaper B. Now, the revenue generated by the newspaper A is equal to the number of copies sold of A times the price of A. Now, we know that P% of the newspaper sold that day were copies of newspaper A. So, the number of copies that were sold that day will be equal to P% of X times 1, since the price of each newspaper A is $1. This gives us Px by 100. Similarly, when we find the revenue that was generated by newspaper B, this will be equal to the number of copies, which will be 100 minus P by 100 times X times the price of one copy, which is 1.25. Now, according to this equation we have in step 2, we have our percent of the revenue, which is the revenue generated by A plus revenue generated by B, will be equal to number of copies of newspaper A that were sold that day. Now, when we substitute the values of the revenue generated by A and revenue generated by B, we have R by 100 times Px by 100 plus 100 minus P times X by 100 into 1.25 is equal to, and the number of copies were P% of X. This is equal to R by 100 times Px plus 100 times 1.25 times X minus 1.25 times Px. This whole is divided by 100, which gives us P by 100 times X. Now 100 gets cancelled on both sides and we are left with R times Px plus 125x minus 1.25 Px divided by 100 equals Px. Now this gives us R times 125x minus 0.25 px by 100 equals px. Now we can take x common from the left hand side and we have rx times 125 minus 0.25 p by 100 equals px. Now x gets cancelled on both sides and we are left with r times 125 minus 0.25 p equals 100 p. Now this gives us r equals 100 p by 125 minus, now 0.25 can be written as 1 by 4 times p, which is equal to 100 p by 500 minus p by 4. This gives us the value of r, p by 500 minus p, which is the option D.